I think, there's discussion here and there's lots to take away, even if you're not in Module 3. Don't ever worry about that. This is still a great time to come and ask questions too. And believe me, everybody enjoys questions and learns something from questions. So that is a great contribution if you have a question for me. So let's get into the fascial lines. And so I'll just recap for 1 sec. We've already looked at the superficial back line. I always present that one first. It's a superficial full body line. So, very easy for us to feel. We talk about and cue for the superficial back line throughout any yoga class. And then, it makes sense to look at the front line because, again, if these two are out of balance, if one of them is out of balance, they're both out of balance. So we need to understand how to balance the front and the back line. And the superficial front line has different characteristics. It's kind of our shield versus the superficial back line is like the backbone of the body. So, it's sort of sandwiching the body and it's helping us do those forward movements, which is really what we do. Like if you think about walking, running, climbing, these are all movements that happen on the sagittal plane. That's this plane right here. Our shoulder movements, for lifting things or picking something up or doing sun salutations, we're doing it on the sagittal plane. And the front and back line are basically in control of those movements that are on the sagittal plane. So what we're looking at today is the lines that control movement on the horizontal and not on the horizontal, on the frontal plane. Okay, so that's this plane right here. Okay, so these are the lateral lines. Now, as we add lines to, what we're studying here, we're going to see that they're going to start overlapping each other at various points. So we'll look at that today. And we'll just sort of see how they interact with each other to some degree. So let me just say, remember, we use the tensegrity model of architecture and biological systems to talk about how our body functions, because we do have these strong lines of reinforcement of fascia in our body, which we call the fascial lines. And these are really helping us in both movement and any activity that we need to stabilize. And we want to understand that better so that we can use them for stability, which is kind of their main job, I guess. And the other thing is how we use them in movement so that movement is, well coordinated and balanced. And, this gives us good long-term outcomes where we're building our body in such a way that, it lasts us longer and it's generally not in pain, it's not breaking down. So this is really what we're aiming for in the practice. And of course, it's a mind-body practice. And for me, I feel like there's so many spiritual lessons I've learned from working with the fascial lines. And they're lessons about connection and support and the value of stability, on the mental, emotional, spiritual plane. And there is definitely a vibratory, energetic quality to practicing with the lines in the way that I suggest. So I'm hoping that's what you experience. One of the teachers who's trained with me a number of times and comes to my classes, she says for her it makes it feel like her fascia is singing. And that's her way of describing that vibratory quality. And I do feel like there is really something to that. And that probably would be another course for me to fully look into that and express that. But, that is a big part of what we're feeling. We're sensitizing our fascia. We're tuning our instrument. There's going to be a vibratory, energetic quality that comes from that. So I do hope that you're experiencing something like that. So let's go into the lateral lines today. And, we've given all the lines a shorthand, what's their main job. And the lateral lines are the main stabilizers. Now, there's a number of reasons why we say that. Remember that human movement takes place mostly on the sagittal plane. I mean, our fundamental movement, like walking, running, climbing, lifting, carrying. But we do lateral movement, and especially if we're playing a sport or playing at all, or dancing, or doing yoga, or many things. And so we also need motivation, movement stability, and then the lateral lines provide the stability for the sagittal plane movements. So they can be nicely controlled and coordinated. And that, again, I always say this, it's not really about an aesthetic alignment, it's about efficiency, because joint efficiency ends up giving us a result of better movement mechanics, better joint efficiency, and that equals better results in our joints and our tissue. So that's kind of what the lateral lines are doing. They're controlling those forward movements. And when I say, they prevent buckling during activity, it's basically that. It's kind of stabilizing these forward movements, so there's not a lot of wasted energy moving side to side. So those of you who have ever done, people watching or something like gait assessment or something, it's always fun to do this in a workshop, not so much fun on Zoom, but you can kind of go and imitate different walking patterns. So if you imagine like, a model walking on a catwalk, that they tend to shift their pelvis, right, from side to side, and that creates an upstream action through the trunk and kind of makes the clothes move around. I guess that's maybe what that's for. But you can also imagine people who walk with very stiff sides, right? And it's like all they do is walk forward and there's no lateral movement at all. And that looks kind of odd and not relaxed or anything either, right? So there's kind of a happy medium between all that lateral movement and that very stiff movement that doesn't allow any movement. So that's, those are sort of the ends of the spectrum. And we're going to look at this a little bit more closely as we go along here. Okay, so that's what I mean about this sort of buckling or waste of energy. And the other thing that the lateral lines do is they work alongside the superficial front line and back line, and even the deep front line, all these spiral line especially, because the lower half of the lateral line pretty much is the same line, same lines of connective tissues as the spiral line. You've probably noticed that. So there's some slight deviation. We're going to look at that next call, so we'll have a look at the specific differences, but it's very similar. Okay, the lower half of the lateral lines, which we're looking at today, and the spiral lines, which we'll look at next time. Okay, so they kind of work together as a tensegrity structure to distribute tension forces throughout the body. So that's what's really happening. Now, the other important thing to know about the lateral lines is these are your main stabilizers for the ankle, the knee, and the hip. We use superficial backline and front line a little bit there for, positioning the ankle, the knee over the ankle, the hip over the knee, pelvic position. But these are the main stabilizers, especially for movement, but also for things like single leg standing balance and things like that. So when we organize and activate, it's really these lateral lines through the legs that we're turning on. So our foot to core connection is kind of between the lateral lines and spiral lines and the deep front line. And then when we do 2 feet on the ground, it's mainly these lateral lines through the leg, but also the spiral line, right? Because they're pretty much the same on the lower half. Okay, so organization and activation is tensioning these lateral lines. So that's a good thing to remember. And remember, we always organize and activate even before we use the superficial back line or the superficial front line. This is our step one, is really turning on these lateral lines in the lower half of the body. We can also do it in the upper half, but we'll look at some postures that do that. Okay, so let's look at the couple places where the lateral lines kind of overlap or intersect with the superficial back line and the superficial front line. Okay, so let's look at splenius capitis Thank you. So these muscles on the back of the neck, if you'll recall, they were part of the superficial back line, okay? And the ones on the front, sternocleidomastoids, those were part of the superficial front line. So that's a place where we're seeing some overlap with the two lines we've looked at already and in this line that we're looking at today. The other place we're going to see some overlap is under the foot. And again, we're going to look at that very specifically because I could talk about feet all day. But we're going to look at where that kind of slides under the superficial back line in the sole of the foot. Okay, so, the reason that Tom Myers decided to allow these overlaps was that there was a continuity of function and tension happening through those lines. So even though they overlap each other, and you'll see this in other tensegrity structures, there's oftentimes an overlap at certain points. That is to maintain that connectivity and distribute tensional balance. Okay, so we're going to expect to see that, and that's basically what I'm saying there. Okay, so let's look at the location, and I would recommend that you use your hands for this and maybe do some contraction. I'm going to give you some things to try in the lower aspect of the line. So we're going to start at the arch of the foot, and I'm going to look at that specifically, so just hold it there for now. But the arch of the foot at the base of the great toe. So again, I'm going to give you a really specific view of that in a moment. And then it goes around the back of the ankle. So this is probably where you could easily pick it up. If you point and flex, so flex and extend your ankle, you can probably feel some tendon behind that ankle, the outer ankle. So like over here, you can feel a strong tendon. It kind of pops out. You can see it through the skin usually. And then slide your hand up the outer aspect of your shin. Okay, and those muscles are called, I've always called them the peroneals, but I know they're also called fibularis. That's because they go along the fibular bone. But so I'm sorry, but some of my images are labeled like with peroneus or peroneus longus and brevis, or some of them are named fibularis. So very sorry about that, but I'm going to keep reminding you that they are often used interchangeably. Okay, so those muscles are on the outside of the shin, and they come up seamlessly to the outer aspect of the knee and even slightly toward the front. And there's like a bony bump there where they say that that's the insertion of your iliotibial tract, or a lot of people call it the iliotibial band. And some of you may be aware of that structure. It's a very fibrous, lots and lots of collagen fibers in that structure. Some people have issues at the knee with that structure, but it doesn't finish right there, is what I'm trying to say. It doesn't, even though they say that's its insertion point, it's more like it's part of this fascial line. It's kind of stuck on and woven into the joint capsule and carries on up the side of the leg. And it's not actually a band, it's a reinforcement in the whole thigh fascia. Okay, but you'll often see it depicted as a band because of these vertical collagen fibers that are so dense. All right, so that's going to come up to the muscles here. Now, these little muscles at the top of the IT band over here, these are called the TFL. That stands for tensor fascial latae. And I have that word here, tensor fascial latae. So this is a good thing to feel. So let's stand on our feet, and I want you to see if you can find your hip bone in the front. You're actually looking for this. You're looking for the sticky outy part of your pelvic bone. And if you can find that, then just slide your fingers toward the sides a bit more. So kind of behind that, toward the sides. And then you should feel some pretty dense tissue. And then if you stand on your feet and you go from one foot to the other, like stand on one foot, take the other one off, just go back and forth a few times, you should feel a muscle contraction there under your fingers. And that would be your tensor fascial latae muscle. These muscles help control your your hip, okay, as you're walking or as you're standing. Again, part of this whole chain of lower body fascia that is very much responsible for stabilizing ankle, knee, and hip. Now, there's some posterior fibers that flow right into the IT tract as well, and these are your glute max and min. So if you were to slide your fingers a little further back from where we just were, more to the very sides of your hips, again, you'll feel some bulky muscles if you go side to side, or stand on one leg and lift your leg out to the side a few times. You're probably going to feel some firm muscle contraction there too. So they both move the hip in those actions, and they stabilize as well. These are movers and stabilizers of the hip. Very, very key muscles. And then we have the obliques. So now if you want to slide up above your pelvic bone and below your ribs into these muscles here, and I kind of like to just take those muscles at the sides of my waist and kind of pinch them between my fingers a little bit, and then lift up one hip and then the other. You can feel those muscles kind of jumping. If you stood still though too and just abducted, so take your leg out to the side, you'll feel like those muscles are active. And we did some good ways of activating those muscles in the palpation exercise for this lesson. You know, having somebody lying on their side and doing some leg lifting and stuff, you can really feel those muscles turn on very, very quickly. These are muscles, you know, that help control your walking mechanics. So they're very active muscles, and you know, the controlling all of your lateral movement and stabilizing your sagittal plane movement. And there's two direction of fibers, so this is kind of interesting. If you were to take your hands and sort of the direction your fingers would go to put your hands in your pockets, those are your external obliques. Okay, those are in the waist, and they go this way, they go downward, like your hands are going in your pockets. And then if you go at right angles to that, that's the direction of your internal obliques. So you have these two diagonal muscles that overlap at pretty much right angles. So again, it's so lovely to see like how muscles and fascia, their fiber direction lines up along the lines of tension that your body uses to move and stabilize. I just find that so fascinating. Okay, and then from there, the intercostal muscles. So you have muscles that, you know, go from one rib to the next rib, and they are internal and external as well. There's two layers, just like your obliques that I just explained, and they do the same thing. Your internal obliques go this way. Your external obliques, costals, your internal intercostals, that just means in between the ribs, goes this way, and your outer ones, externals, go that way, the exact same as the oblique fiber direction. So again, I find that interesting. Now there's a reason why that these diagonal direction of fibers are going to be important, and we're going to look at our walking mechanics and how they're involved in walking mechanics, because it's not just your legs that walk, right? It's your whole body. So we're going to look at that. And then, yeah, you've seen the spleniae and the sternocleidomastoid, because those are pretty strong muscles. They're kind of maintaining your head position. As I said, your whole body walks, and this is a lot like other activities. There might be a ton of activity going on in your body, but your head is not waving around all over, right? Your head usually stays where you can see where you're going or keep the eyes on the horizon or whatever. So head control is pretty important. And so partly why you've got such strong muscles that are involved in these main stabilizing lines of the body. So there you go. Those are the structures. And we'll go on to look at the great toe connection. Because I love talking about the feet, and the great toe, guys, is so, so important to how your foot functions. And as I've said already on several other lessons, if you have lost foot function, it's going to affect your whole body. So let's look at some really cool things about the lateral line and how it intersects with the superficial front line and the deep front line, which we're not going to get to for a while. But anyways, it's still super, super interesting. Okay, so we were just looking at the peroneals or the fibularis muscles, right? Okay, and we here they are here. So here's a nice view of them. They're under this muscle is the bone, right? You've got a bone that goes down here, right? Because you've got two bones in your lower leg. This is the skinnier one. This is your main lower leg bone, the tibia. This is the fibula, which is why they call this muscle fibularis. Okay, and you've got a long fibularis and a short one. Okay, so the long one is really long. It goes right from the top of the bone all the way down behind your ankle. This is on the outer aspect of your shin, round behind, and then it goes right under the foot. And let me show you, this is it right here. This is the tendon. This is the fibularis longest tendon. It goes under your foot all the way over to the base of your great toe. So we're talking the base of your great toe right over here. Here's your great toe. Here's the metatarsal, and your fibularis goes under that and around up the side of your leg. So what makes that so interesting is obviously it has partial control of the great toe and the arch and the ankle. So it was pretty cool. It's very important in adjusting your foot and ankle position during walking, which we will look at closely now. Why I'm so excited to tell you about this, here again, now which foot is this? This is, say, the sole of your right foot. Okay, so if you can wrap your head around that. Here's your great toe. Here's the peroneus or fibularis longus insertion. Okay, see, there's the base of your great toe, metatarsal, and there it wraps under the foot, and then it goes up. It's going to wrap around the ankle over here. But look what also attaches just opposite it is your tibialis anterior insertion, and that is a muscle we looked at last time with the superficial front line, and here it is here. It's in front of the shin, right along the bone of your shin, and this is a muscle that gets kind of tender, if you're doing a lot of stairs or hill climbing or something like that. So that its tendon wraps around the inside of your foot, okay? So around the inside in front of your inner ankle, okay, if you can understand what I'm saying there. And so they actually form, they call it a stirrup under the foot. They both connect, so both of these muscles connect to the base of the great toe under the foot. And then you have one more muscle, and this has a really broad tendon. It attaches to all these bones here, which you can't really see. But this is your tibialis posterior, which is a deep calf muscle, and that's part of the deep front line. So we'll get to look at that again when we look at the deep front line. But just look at all these tendons that connect to the great toe. So, and there's more, of course, like the great toe has long muscles and short muscles just controlling it. So again, that lets you know that it's a very, very important structure in the body for foot function, for ankle function, and for everything that happens up above it. Okay, so all of this is happening in the arch of the foot. Now, I wish I could do this. I wish I could lay another layer, but there's actually about 4 layers of tissues and muscles under your foot. And we looked at one, the plantar fascia, remember? We looked at that with the superficial back line, and that lays over these. So there's a couple layers of muscles, and the plantar fascia is actually on top of all of those. So again, that's the superficial back line connection. So we're already seeing like 4 lines connecting under the foot. How exciting is that? Okay, so we're going to be looking at foot position and stuff here in a moment too. Okay, so let's look a little more specifically at the features and different issues people might have with the lateral lines, mainly the lower half, first of all. Because, just like the superficial back line and superficial front line, there's different needs and different capacities, etc., that are part of, the upper and the lower half will have different qualities because of that, because of how we use our body and the kind of structures we find there. So the main feature of the lateral lines to remember is there are main stabilizing lines, especially of the ankle, knee, and hip. And they control pelvic balance, which is, again, You may not have thought of it before, whatever, but it's quite important to the way your body functions, whether or not you're going to have like something like low back pain or just various issues affecting the pelvis, anything from, pelvic floor health to continence and all kinds of things like that. So pelvic positioning and health is super, super important. And these are the main stabilizers of the pelvic balance. Now, a really important thing, again, if a fascial line is really about stability, number one, as its number one job, it's going to make sense, and it makes it easy to remember that there's going to be a lot of collagen. So if you look at these super strong tendons of the peroneals or the fibularis muscles, very, very strong. There's actually a lot of connective tissue throughout these muscles as well. And by that, I mean fascial tissue specifically. This iliotibial tract, when it's under tension, it feels like a bone. It's so dense and strong. Again, you've got tensor fasciae lata has a lot of collagen throughout its muscle fibers. Same thing with your obliques and your intercostals. This is a little bit gross for you all probably, but if you've ever eaten ribs, there's a lot of connective tissue on ribs. So again, that is to help with stability, although not human ribs, of course. So just keep in mind that lots of collagen, very strong fibers, is how this line is built. That's a particular quality so that it performs its function well. So I would let go of the idea of thinking that you need to stretch this line. Especially, I know people will often complain about tight iliotibial bands, and I'm pretty sure, God doesn't make mistakes like that. If you have an actually tight iliotibial band, it would probably be the result of an injury or some kind of nervous condition, like actually losing nerve sensation so that the tissue shrinks up or something like that, or you go into contracture. But usually, if you're having issues with your knee, it's going to have something to do with your foot mechanics. I know for a while when I used to be more into running, it had to do with my gait. So there was a particular speed that was just sort of a no-go for me. If I ran at that speed, I was going to have knee issues. If I went a little bit faster, a little bit slower, I was fine. If I varied the terrain, yeah, I was fine. It dislikes super, super repetitive action in a short range. So we can talk about that more if you've ever had that issue or you're struggling with it now. We don't usually see iliotibial tract issues showing up in yoga, okay? But what we do see is people with lots of knee pain and stuff, right? Or they can't keep their knees centered properly, things like that, because, they're probably not tapping into this line for stability. So that's why we teach people how to dial it out, because then you can tap into this line for your lateral knee stability. And that is really the main place that your knee gets stability, is through this structure, which is of course attached to your whole joint capsule, and it's all part of that. But if you want to, move into a stable knee, that's where you're going to find it, by dialing out into that structure. All right, so even if there's some dysfunction there or it's painful, it's usually not a solution to stretch it. You have to find out what's the mechanical issue that's causing discomfort or something there. Often it's in the foot. We're going to look at some ankle mechanics and stuff too today. So, that's usually the clue. Okay, so let's look at some of, trauma reflex. So we'll look at that specifically too. This is associated with trauma reflex, which is kind of the third reflex. I mentioned the red light reflex, which is more associated with the front body. It's a protective reflex. That makes sense. The front body, superficial front line, is more about protection, shielding you, protecting you. And then the green light reflex is more associated with the back body, because that is causing you to stand up straight in the face of resistance or whatever else that is happening. And then the trauma reflex, oh, excuse me, I want to sneeze. The trauma reflex has to do usually with, our one-sidedness. We have a dominant side oftentimes. Some people have a very strongly dominant side. We may have some kind of repetitive action that we do in an occupation, or if you play an instrument or something like that. And then, if you've had an injury, right? If you sprain an ankle or you fall or something like that, it's usually one side is injured more than the other. You fall on one hip. You don't usually fall on hips, or you don't usually sprain the ankle exactly on both sides at one time, that kind of thing. It's usually one side or the other, and then you end up compensating, and then that causes some imbalances in the lateral lines. So these are things that can happen, and that is associated with the trauma reflex. So there are ways of working with the trauma reflex, like unwinding the trauma reflex with some somatic practices and things like that, rather than getting in there and trying to stretch the fascia or something like that, which is not going to want to be stretched. Okay, so but we're not here for therapy. I'm just making you aware of the potential. Okay, now let's look at some specific issues that are very common, very, very common. So deviations at the ankle, which is not exactly at the ankle, it's just beyond the ankle. We'll look at that more specifically. Your ankle joint is just a hinge joint. You've got this tibia bone sitting on top of a bone called the talus, and it can slide inward or a little bit outward, and then that causes the deviation. It's not the hinge joint itself per se. Well, we have some images where we can see that. Your knee collapsing or even bow-leggedness could be associated with this. Oftentimes people who are bow-legged also supinate. So, and that means that they probably have a weak deep front line. They don't know how to ground the great toe, or they don't habitually do it. So that's kind of, what's going on there. But again, we'll look at the knee collapsing problem and whatnot. If you have any questions about that, you can ask. Of course, iliotibial pain, usually it's around here. I know quite a lot about that. If you have issues with it, or, have a student or somebody with it, I can give you some ideas. And then pelvic tilting and rotations. Now, it's great if you can tilt your pelvis in numerous ways, but if you sort of habitually over tilt in a particular direction, then that's not so good. Actually, what I really want to focus on here is the lateral tilt. So I'm not talking about anterior posterior tilt so much, but tilting on one side. Maybe you have a preferred leg that you like to stand on, so you keep that leg straight and let the other hip drop down and let the knee bend. And then maybe you switch sides, but maybe you're actually spending, 75% on this one leg and only 25 on the other, or something like that. Or a lot of people who have a preferred, like sitting sitting with a leg crossed over, not in yoga sukhasana, but, just sitting with crossed legs. A lot of people have like a habitual side, and that can cause like changes in the connective tissues over time. And then you have kind of a hiked hip on one side. So there's all kinds of things that could account for it. And then of course, we have our dominant side. We actually do use the body for different things on each side. So, it's not going to be surprising that there's some differences from side to side. And I mean, that's okay. A lot of these differences are never going to bother you in your day-to-day life. But when you're in a mindful practice like yoga and you're doing this side and then that side, you're probably going to notice that, it's really easy on this side, a little harder on that side, So sometimes we notice these things. And that just gives you the opportunity to, maybe spend a little more time where you're struggling, or take steps to regain some balance. And sometimes that's just changing the habit or creating a bit more awareness. It's not always, big changes that need to happen.
Before you go on,
okay.
Lee was saying that it seems like hip or knee surgery could cause lateral line imbalances.
Oh, yeah. Lee, it says it's probably probable that knee or hip surgery would cause lateral deviation problems. I would say, yeah, 100%. Like I know I was just talking to a student yesterday who was saying like they had a fall on a wrist and they broke fractured the radius, and unfortunately did not receive the right treatment because a healing bones actually can heal pretty fast if they're given the right conditions, right? So but she did not meet with the right conditions in terms of I don't know, the physio she happened to be working with didn't know really what to do with her, was really stretching the tissue, which was not indicated, and then misadventures for about a year and a half, and now she has a surgeon who says that her ulna is now way longer than her radius, or I don't know, longer than it used to be, which doesn't seem possible to me. And he wants to do surgery and take out a chunk of that bone. And I just, that does not sound like a good idea. So just so you know, like any surgery, even, now they're smart, right? They just make a pinhole if they can and go in and, disrupt the tissue as little as possible. So those kind of surgeries, you're not disrupting the fascial lines all that much, or all of these tension lines in the body that are so important for balance and control. You're not disrupting them a lot. But something like a knee replacement or a hip replacement, they're not going to be able to help but disrupt that. They're going to try to minimize that as much as possible, but then you have to look at recovery. Recovery takes time. Even if you're loading it and whatnot, you're obviously going to have to favor it a little. You're going to have to change your movement patterns. You're certainly not going to be able to walk like this. And so, during the healing phase, it's very important to get the right kind of stimulus. And oftentimes, there are things you can do, and it's not easy. If you've had an injury or something like that, and you have somebody saying that surgery would fix the problem for you, it might seem like an easier path, but if there is any soft tissue work you can do to strengthen, you're better off doing that before surgery. And sometimes you don't need surgery if you're willing to do that work. Surgery is not easy to go through, and either way, you're going to have a lot of work to do on that soft tissue to either heal from surgery or to do what needs to be done to prevent surgery. So unfortunately, we don't have the technology to just, with the snap of fingers, fix the tissue or fix the problem. So that's why, we want to get out ahead of these issues as much as possible. So definitely any kind of surgery or injury. Now, we'll look at a few of the other possibilities of creating imbalances in these lateral lines. And so again, I really want, maybe, next walk you take, you want to think about how your lateral lines are actually helping you channel your movement forward rather than losing energy from side to side. And I know on the particular walk I take, sometimes I meet with people. I feel like I'm always assessing gait when I see other people walking or running. And you can see that how one-sided a lot of people are. They really lean to one side over and over again. It's really interesting how people can be recognized from a long ways away just by the way they walk. We have such strong characteristics within our walking sometimes. Okay, so now this is kind of the unique thing about, so far in the lines we've looked at with the lateral lines, because there's two lines and they're completely separate from each other, right? They're on other sides of the body from each other. So for them to be in balance is really key. So, just like the superficial back line needs to be in balance with the superficial front line, these two lateral lines really need to balance each other off. And again, I really feel like our yoga practice is a place to really get to know where we are out of balance and maybe make changes. A lot of sideways movement, you just associate it with kind of an inefficient movement pattern. It usually indicates there's a weakness somewhere. We all have our dominant side, but other things too, like repeated movement patterns, repeated postural patterns, even sleeping patterns can affect that. If you have a preferred side you want to sleep on, your tissues are going to arrange themselves around that over time. And so here's one thing I wanted to show you, if the walking on the catwalk kind of thing, where there's going to be a lot of sideways shifting and even, shoulder girdle shifting as a result, that indicates usually, like if you see this out in the world, it often indicates a glute med weakness. So there's tests that a physical therapist would do to see if you have a weakness there, especially if it's causing like issues at the knee, which it can often do. It can also cause back issues as well, because your pelvis is not as stable as it needs to be in terms of as efficiently doing its movement on the plane, and you end up getting a lot of additional extra movement that shouldn't be happening at the spine. When you walk, your spine is going to kind of undulate a little bit forward and back, sagittal plane movement, but it doesn't, and it rotates a little bit too. We'll look at that, but it doesn't sway back and forth, right? Because you just know intuitively that would be a total waste of energy, and it is, and it can be really, really tough on the intervertebral joints and their discs. So, we definitely want to get stronger on both sides. That helps us with our single leg standing balances and our yoga practice quite a lot. So I'm going to skip to the next slide. Okay. All right. So, let's look at walking, okay? Your yoga practice can make you a better walker. Walking is such a key activity for humans. It's just absolutely essential. Okay, so what I'd like to do here first is just look at the legs and the fascial lines here in walking. So this lateral line that we're looking at, here's your tensor fasciae lata. What do you think this is doing as it, flows into the iliotibial tract, or sometimes some people call it the band? And then see how that goes right on without skipping a beat into tibialis anterior. You can see probably intuitively that helps move your leg forward. Yeah? You can probably sense that. Your iliotibial band is going to stabilize that forward movement. And then back here, this is your glute med and your glute max. They're going to pull the leg back. They're going to pull, from the hip. So as you swing your leg through, you've got muscles on the front side of the hip that help swing your leg forward, and on the back side that swing it back. And this very fibrous structure in the middle just kind of mediating that action, forward and back, forward and back, forward and back. And it's kind of controlling it so there's not a lot of sideways action. That's ideally what's supposed to be happening. Okay, now what's going on at the foot? So again, I find this kind of interesting. A lot of, if you go looking for running shoes, or if you have your feet assessed, you might have somebody tell you that, well, you tend to pronate or you tend to supinate. But pronation and supination, we could also call them inversion and eversion, just other words, but they're using all of those words here. So I'm going to feel free to do that. Let's see. We see this little R. That means we're looking at the right foot. So what we're seeing here is the right foot. So this is your outer ankle, okay? And this is the great toe side of your foot. Okay, so when your foot over here first strikes the ground, it needs to lock itself because it's bracing for impact, basically. Impact is really good for your body, so don't worry about that. But then it's going to go into supination. Okay, so this word inversion, if you were to look at your foot and then move your foot so that the soles of your feet came toward each other, that would be inversion. Eversion is where they try to face away from each other. Okay, so you can sort of see here on this first image, this is where your foot is going to strike the ground. You're going to have an arch in your foot at that point, and it's a rigid arch. It's hitting the ground, and so it's not as stable as it is over here, but the rear foot is at an angle called inversion. So, you don't need to know all this stuff, but just so you know that your foot goes through phases of inversion, eversion, and inversion with every step you take. So inversion and eversion, or pronation and supination, are not dysfunctions in the foot. They're normal actions of the foot. It's just when you get stuck in one position or the other that it might be problematic. Okay, you're going to roll through your foot. You actually, so your arch drops down, okay, in mid stance when your weight's kind of on it, but it's getting ready to spring back up and propel you forward right after that. Okay, the toe off position. So you go through, you position your foot in this position just before you strike. Your foot is in a fairly rigid foot position as you strike. Then you pronate, and then you supinate again. Okay, so these are a normal walking phase, all right, for the ankle. We're going to look, though, at what happens if you kind of are stuck in overpronation all the time or over supination all the time. Is, how would that show up in your yoga practice, or how would that change your movement? Okay, so that's if you cannot, invert, pronate, supinate like that, then you're going to have a really rigid foot. You probably won't be able to take long strides. You probably have to shorten up your strides. So this is, again, what we see as people get older, and if they're not maintaining their foot mechanics, they take smaller steps, right? And they're not able to use the foot as a springboard. And that's when they often start padding up the feet and everything because they can't handle impact anymore. If you think of a springboard, like in gymnastics, it's pretty firm. And when you hit that thing, it's basically loading it, and it's going to spring you forward, right? And your foot arch is doing a very similar thing. Yeah, when it drops down into pronation, it's just basically loading itself so it can launch you forward. So again, these are just cool things to know. You may not get to talk about it a lot in your yoga practice, but this is what you will see in yoga. So remember, we've got these ankle movements, plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. But if you find that you have hypermobility here or limited mobility, it might be from something a little further down, like we were just looking at, pronation and supination. So on this picture, you can see this is a pronated foot. See, the arch is dropping. You can even see this lack of space under there, okay? But this, on the other hand, is supination. And you can see, maybe it's hard to tell, but she's got a really high arch. And you can look at this and see that she kind of looks like she's leaning into the outside of her foot, whereas this definitely looks like you're leaning to the inside of the foot. And I think this is a really good picture because it shows what it does to the heel. Supination can be really hard. It can really rub the heel for some reason. I've noticed this over the years with people who supinate. They have a rigid foot, and this is a result. They'll often have a lot of callousing at the back of the heel. You can see here too that that's probably where their shoe's going to wear out too, right? On that outer edge, right? Because that's the part that's, scraping the ground all the time. Okay, so let's look at this. Here's a supinated foot. This is your calf muscle and your Achilles tendon or calcaneal tendon, right? Which should go straight down. It should go straight down and across the ankle at the back of the ankle, which that looks pretty efficient, right? This, again, you can intuit that looks a bit stiffer. It is a bit stiffer. A habitually supinated foot or a rigid foot, it is stiffer. It's usually called a rigid foot. And then a pronated foot, it looks collapsed, right? It's breaking toward the inside. It's usually associated with a lack of stability. And oftentimes people who are super, super flexible, they easily pronate. But you can overpronate for other reasons too. For instance, if you walk with your feet turned out habitually, that is going to push you into pronation. If you walk with your feet, you just wouldn't walk with your feet turned out in with supinated feet. You might walk with your feet turned in slightly, actually. So, what you want to do is orient the great toe forward when you're walking. Again, just a more efficient movement pattern. Usually in yoga poses, if you're trying to get a bit more range of motion at your ankle, you'll pronate. You'll let the instep drop, and you'll squeeze out a little more range of motion in something like a full malasana, like all the way to the bottom of the squat, or something like even warrior poses like warrior 2, or any pose where you're basically have a long stance with your foot out to the side, and you're having a difficult time keeping like the heel down and the foot orientation. If you let the heel drop in, this often goes alongside with hyperextension at the knee, and then you're in the position, but it's a locked out position at the knee and a collapsed position at the foot. So again, this is why like dialing out solves that problem, right? By now you probably know that if the great toe and the great toe mound were grounded and I was dialing out, this arch would lift up and we would have ankle stability and knee stability. So that's how simple it is. It's solving those problems. Even this foot, like you can see, this great toe does not want to stay on the ground. So if the practice was keeping the great toe and the great toe mound on the ground and dialing it out, we'd get a better alignment here. Okay, so that's really important. The other part too is potentially, this mouse is not going to work. It's giving up the ghost. Potentially, yeah, it's dead. You could have other cues like squeeze the heels together. Again, there's a lack of deep front line activity in this foot pattern. Like supination probably go hand in hand with bow-leggedness. So, thank you.
No,
it's not going to work.
I will get you a new mouse.
The mouse battery just decided it was done. So I gave you a couple clues here. Think about this for your own body, and you may have students where it will be helpful. But usually the pronated foot, so that is the foot that the arch wants to drop. Like a lot of people whose arch wants to drop, they can lift it up again if they dial it out. And so dialing it out and practicing strengthening your foot, you can maintain your arch a little bit better. But if it's kind of natural for your arch to fall in, or if you have a flat foot, that will probably give you more range of motion at the ankle. Again, it's technically cheating. It's not good to practice that way, but because that will go along with your knee collapsing and whatnot too. And then on the other hand, supination tends to go hand in hand with a limited range of motion at the ankle. It's a stiffer foot altogether. So again, that's just something to keep in mind. I mean, we're not doing assessment or anything, but I know a lot of times you're looking at your students and you're going like, why is that happening? And just understanding the feet better, I think, gives you a lot of cues about why things happen at the knee and at the hip. Okay. So I would say, I'm trying to make this as easy for you as possible. Like there's all these details we could go into, and hopefully that's not stressing you out or anything, because I'm just telling you for interest. The main thing to remember and to keep practicing, and if you don't understand it, if there's any part of it that doesn't make sense to you, we really need to look at it, because so many problems are solved by just organizing and activating. That's how simple it is. So let's look at a couple, common things we're going to see, like this in chair pose. A lot of people hug their knees, and why are they doing that? Because they're not using their lateral lines to stabilize the knee. They're stabilizing the right knee against the left knee, right? And then they probably, if they don't have enough ankle range of motion, this is going to happen. Okay, so they'll fan their feet out, and that's basically a pronated. They're going to drop into their arch, right? It's cheating. Not that there's like a competition or anything like that, but again, we're looking for joint efficiency. We want to use our joints in a respectful position. So this is not great for your joints. You're letting the arch fall in, so you've got your feet turned out. Your knees are, stabilizing on each other. And, it's if somebody has a weakness and they're just not understanding like how to find those lateral lines, doing something like this can really help. So I use straps quite a lot. You don't have to go into toe stand. I just happen to have a picture with the strap. But you can see how that would work on your arch, right? Strengthening the arch, orienting the feet straight forward. So something like this is definitely something I use in my classes, but you can have the heels down in chair pose. You can do the chair pose with a twist or whatever, but it really gives the people a chance to feel those lateral lines. Like they're so obvious once you've pressed into the strap with them. And then you can, take the strap off and people will usually still feel it. They'll still be able to find those lateral lines. So I just feel like this is a really useful tool in a yoga class when you're trying to really drive something home and teach your students. You can do this, standing into Tadasana and then going into chair and standing into Tadasana and going into chair. I'm sure that's on some of our videos. There's all kinds of things. Doing twisted chair. I use this for bridge pose. I use it for wheel pose, really helping people find their lateral lines. Okay, so great to experiment with that. I do invite you to do that. So this is another thing that we see all the time. This is the knee collapsing in Warrior 2. So again, I'm hoping that you can look at this now and go, well, she just needs to dial that out, right? The great toe needs to be grounded. And then we, use our external rotators at the hip and we dial that knee out and it pulls it into alignment. So we could say, well, your knee needs to be over your ankle. But if you position it there, is it going to stay there? Probably not. It's going to slip back into this because it's not actively pulling itself there. So that's what the fascial lines do. When we tap into the fascial lines, it gives us a very secure activated position that is secure. Like we're not gonna slide out of that position first thing. Okay, so great toe grounds, dial the knee out. Both of these legs are dialing out. We have great toe grounded on the back foot and pinky edge sealed. This, I know it looks kind of hyperextended, but it's not. I could let it lock back. This is not locked back. And pressing through that foot and dialing this leg out is going to make sure that knee does not lock back. So again, we're dialing out on both those legs. Yeah, so let me know if you have any questions about that or want me to talk about a different posture. There's some questions. Okay, let's have some questions.
So Lee was saying, would you ever do a very subtle dial out while walking? I was playing around this the other day. While I was walking the other day, each step I could dial out a tiny bit.
Yeah, like sometimes I play around with that with walking too. So you don't want to disrupt your natural walking. You want that to be as natural as possible, but it is good to play with it. So I'll do things like, well, number one, I make sure that I'm walking with my feet straight. And then the other thing I'll do is I'll, with the ball of the foot, the great toe ball of the foot, right, the base of the great toe, and the great toe itself, I'll ground through there, push off of it, and just really emphasize my push off with just a slight outward dial. You don't need a lot of dialing there because you're in motion, right? You're not staying grounded like short foot. You're in motion. So you just have this like a split second there. So that is, for me, it really charges up the arch of my foot. I can feel my lateral line, my deep front line. And so I would invite people to play with that a little bit, play with it, but then just go into your rhythmic walking, arm swinging, whatever. Yeah, it's good to do that. It's good to feel the difference. And I always include a bunch of walking and in-person workshops because people learn a lot about themselves when they examine their walking patterns and everything. It's pretty illuminating. So it's a good practice. Anything else?
Yes. Kara
Kara?
says, how does the strap in chair compare to using a block between the thighs in chair?
Okay. Yeah, so it's the exact opposite, Kara. So using a strap around the outer aspect of the legs, you're activating outward, right? You're activating into your lateral lines. When you put a block between your legs, hopefully you can still maintain your dialing out energy. But then if you're squeezing the block, you're activating your deep front line. Okay, so your deep front line is more at the deep back of the calf and inseams of the legs. So that's what you're squeezing the block with. Now, at the same
Okay.
time, you want to keep your feet parallel and energize at the same time, like you're dialing out, but you can dial out and squeeze in at the same time. I hope
Okay.
that
I'm
makes
just
sense.
curious. It does. I'm just curious about like, because I've seen people using blocks, or I've used blocks between the thighs so
Hmm.
much in the past.
Yeah.
Um, if that cueing is sort of, if you're saying that that's wrong in a sense, or if
No,
it's just a different intention.
no. I hope everybody understands that especially in these lessons, the specific fascial lines. I'm just talking about experiencing that line, working with that particular line. But this is a good time
Okay.
to say it, and thank you for reminding me, Kara. I just make sure you understand that everything's kind of on all at the same time, but we're just taking our focus to certain lines at a time. If you're organized and activated, you turned on your lateral lines, your spiral lines, hopefully you're balancing superficial front line and back line. It's all on. Deep front line will turn on with organization and activation too. Well, when we get to the deep front line, I'll explain like that. You have to organize and activate to activate the deep front line. So that's why I think Kara is so good to really help people understand the deep front line activation. You really need to organize and activate for that too. And it's the same organization and activation every time, but it gives you access to the deep front line at the same time. And again, this relationship with the great toe. The great toe is directly related to pelvic floor function. So that's why organization and activation, you're doing that from the great toe. The great toe is now part of, an active tensegrity system. That means your pelvic floor is part of an active tensegrity system. So, okay. Yeah, blocks between the legs I use for lots of different things too. We use different tools to set, kind of to drive home certain concepts, right? Or we want to, help people access something in their body, and we use different tools to illuminate that. Yeah, yeah. So it's good. Anything else?
Yeah, Lee mentioned I always learn the cue. Make sure you can see your big toe.
Yeah.
I like great toe grounds and dial the feet out better.
Well, in something like chair pose or in Warrior Two, I will often say that. Can we just move
Yes.
the
Sorry.
people over? Thank you. So there it is. It's back. Okay, so here, when the knee is centered properly, like right here, you wouldn't, if I looked down, I probably wouldn't be able to see my great toe. But when my knee is organized and activated, I can look down and I can see my whole great toe and my knuckle and probably the arch of my foot. So, that is a good little check-in to say, like, make sure you can see that because, even when people set themselves up, if they haven't had a lot of practice with it, they may drift back. That's why they need to be reminded so many times. I have really experienced people in my classes sometimes, and they really want me to keep reminding them. So I sort of chuckle at it, but I feel like I'm saying the same things all the time, but that's what they need. So yeah, and seeing the great toe is really good. Also in chair pose, get people to balance their feet parallel, and then if they want to have their feet apart, if that feels better in their hips and gives them a bit more ease at the ankles or something, that's great. They don't have to have their feet right together, especially if this is what's going to happen. And then, you want to see all 10 of your toes, when you look down past your knees, right? So you don't want the knees pushed out over the feet again. Yeah. So we want to, and again, the reason we're doing that is so we can light up those pelvic muscles, all those muscles around the hips and pelvis. So, otherwise, if we lean forward, we're just going to activate the quads, around the knees. And, well, that's fine if you want to do that. But these are the really important muscles, around the hips and the pelvis. So, it depends on what your goal is. If you're just trying to give people an experience, get them to try this and that and the other thing just to get to know their body better, then the sky's the limit, just let people explore and experiment. But when you're trying to teach habits, then you have to be a bit more particular. That's what I would say about that. And all learning is good.
And Carmen had a question, I believe.
Did you have a question, Carmen?
Yes, well, more like a comment. I tried that block between the legs and activating, and it seems like you're not squeezing the block. You're just holding it in place when you had activated the outer edges or the side.
You can do it like that, but you can also squeeze.
Yeah?
Yeah, you just have to be positioned, such that you can squeeze. Make sure your feet are close enough together. So that's the thing, right? We don't want to have our feet wider apart than our knees.
Okay.
Right? So if you're going to have a block between your feet, then you have to have your feet close enough together so that while you're organized and activated, you can still squeeze the block. So wiggle around with it a little bit more, Carmen. I guarantee you'll be able to get there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Nicoletta says, what do you do in the case of weakened knees?
What do you do in the case of weakened knees? Well,
A YouTube sequence for that.
the hip and knee rescue.
No, there's a full.
Oh, yeah. If you look at the full practices, there's like in that are in the extra resources for the course, there's like a whole yoga practice for knees. Did you ever see that? And then there's hip and knee rescue as well. But it's basically practicing organization and activation. So in that yoga sequence for the knees, you'll see a whole bunch of different ways that I use straps, and that's probably what this picture's from. I use straps and blocks and all kinds of different challenges to the knee and the knee stability. There's some really good ones in there now that I think about it. So that will give you lots of ideas. Knees, when knees are weak, their tendency is to fall inward. Yeah. So that makes it really easy. So something like working with a strap is ideal for that. Work with a strap in chair pose, work with a strap in like bridge poses. There's some really good knee strengthening. They're kind of physical therapy exercises, but they're appropriate for a yoga class. So if that's okay, check that out, Nicoletta. Okay.
Yes, thank you. I will check. But I think it's also about the ligaments in the knee, because she had a little bit of balance in the knee, so she can stand in a pose with the lateral knee bended outside, but not inside. So I think something it's also wrong in the knee itself, and on top of it, the muscles are weak. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, ligaments are not muscle. They're just checking movement, right? So if we're trying to get them to do something that they're not really designed to do, they're not going to like it. So really address the muscles, which is going to help address the fascia and the joint capsule. It's all going to get stronger if you work with the muscles. Isometrics, right? These are safe for the knee. She can just stay in the range that she can control, and work with straps, work with blocks, it takes time. It takes a long time, but there's lots of ideas in that practice.
Okay.
Look at hip and knee rescue, and look at the full sequence on knees, the full practice.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Let's go on to the next slide.
Okay, I need to touch the computer for a second.
Okay. Oh, is this where we're at? Okay. Okay. We're still working on the lower half of the lateral lines. What's that?
118.
118. A story of my life. I don't know where the time goes. Anyways, we're stabilizing now. These are other things you're going to see a lot in your class. So oftentimes we see when people are raising their leg forward, maybe they're using a strap, but we often see this, right? This is an indication of that glute med weakness that we saw here. You see how the pelvis slopes down at an angle? So that's basically what's going on here. Trying to haul that leg up using the obliques, and the pelvis is tilting. This is a sign of glute med weakness. We're going to see that over here too. So yes, we get our energy moving upward through organization and activation, even on one leg, right? Look at even here, this is perfect because the great toe's lifted. So, oftentimes the great toe's lifted. Maybe this is hyperextending. Everything up the chain is going to be affected by that. Here we got the great toe grounding, knee dialing out. That automatically helps you level. What's this leg going to do? Does anybody know what this leg needs to do? We have a hand to foot connection, so we're able to do what with this leg to keep the pelvis as balanced as possible? Anybody know?
Press out with the big toe.
Press out with the big toe, but in terms of
Pull back on the hip.
Okay. What are we doing with this leg? We're externally rotating at the hip, right? I mean, we're organizing and activating. So you would do the same
Dialing
here.
out.
You would do the same
Yeah.
here. You dial out.
Oh.
Yep. You're pushing the
Yeah.
toe into, this is just like pushing it into the ground, and then you're going to dial the knee out, and the hip is going to drop down. Like, I've got my
Oh, that's
tissue.
cool. I never thought of that.
Yeah, you're dialing out. If this were open chain, it would still work because your hip is flexed. I'm sorry, I know this gets a little bit complicated for people, but anytime your leg is forward like this or neutral, you dial it out. This leg, which is behind, you wouldn't dial it out. You would just press back into the great toe. You don't need to dial this out. Okay, because the leg's behind you. That's, again, if I could walk you around the room, I could probably help you understand that. But dialing out is always what happens from the neutral position to a flex position. But when you get the leg behind you, then that leg, in some postures, like if this was open and we were standing on one leg and that leg was up in the air behind us, we'd have to dial it in.
Right.
Okay? We'd use the deep front line and we would dial it in. But that's because in walking, you externally rotate and then you internally rotate, and you externally rotate and you internally rotate. This is how walking is happening at the hip if you're not walking with your feet all turned out. Okay? So that's just the shape of the joint and how we work with that shape. Okay? So, the other thing too, to keep it simple, is just push straight back into that foot when you have something to push into. If the leg's up in the air behind you, you've got to dial it in. That's how we talk about it. We'll have more time to talk about it. That's kind of a deep front line thing. So we'll go into that in a couple calls from now. We'll look into that a bit more. So we're seeing basically the same thing. We can see that this hip, this glute med, is a little bit weak. It cannot hold this pelvis up. And more or less, maybe just hanging on the joints is going to cause that too. Maybe if we activated, we'd get level. you know? So again, what's happening here, dialing this knee out, that draws the hip back and centers the hip. And then we can press into the great toe. And, if you want, you can push into the great toe and kind of press this hip forward. And, there's little refinements that you can do. But just so you're aware, these are lateral lines that are helping us. When we dial out, we're dialing into those lateral lines, also the spiral lines. But, that is our lateral stability. And that really helps us, when we're trying to, if we activate, the body understands that better than saying, can you just lift this hip up a bit? Then the body's like, hell, what do I access to do that? So it's just repeating organization and activation. People start to just move that way and set themselves up that way. And they realize that it applies to every pose. And every now and then you'll get a question, well, am I dialing in or out for this? But, that's a simple question to answer then. It's not like you have to fix all the joints. You just, how do you organize and activate? And then, okay, now we're good. There may be, as I say, a few more refinements you want to make, or maybe you're trying to challenge yourself to a new level of the posture, something that's different. But organizing and activating helps to set up the pelvis in a more level position. And that really helps us in balancing. Okay, so let's go on. But of course, if you have other questions. Now, again, here we are. The lateral line is quite different, the lower half versus the upper half. Now, the upper half is also main stabilizers of the trunk of the body. But because what you have here, and I should have superimposed it on this picture now that I think about it, but remember I was saying that these fibers are on this diagonal, and the underneath fibers, the layer underneath that, are on the opposite angle. So that is kind of like being laced up the side. So that is facilitating trunk rotation during walking. So we need a little bit of trunk rotation, not a lot, and we don't need a bunch of sideways movement. We just want this little bit of rotational action every step we take. So we'll look at that a little more closely in a moment. So it coordinates that stability during walking, and obviously it's seamlessly connected to the lower body. And so it's a coordination of movement from what the legs are doing through like how our impact forces and muscle contraction and the limbs swinging through, how is that all coordinated in the upper body? So it's really very much about coordinating these dynamic actions while walking. That's what your upper lateral lines do. And then you'll see that it supports your rotational postures. Now, I would say a lot of rotational postures, you're probably experiencing the spiral lines a little bit more. You can think about your lateral lines as more the stabilizers of rotational movement. Okay, that doesn't sound too complicated. And then, it's helping your superficial front line and superficial back line in that upright posture. And then, it's stabilizing the pelvis and trunk during hip abduction. So that there's sometimes, right, where you're holding your legs still and your upper body is moving from side to side. And sometimes you need to hold your upper body still and take the leg out to the side, or single leg standing balance if it's to the side, or we'll look at a couple images of postures. So sometimes it has to be that stable base because your legs are going to move to the side in a yoga pose, and sometimes it's the trunk that's moving. So both of those actions are facilitated by the fascial lines, the lateral lines. Okay, but of course, you don't get through life without not having issues occasionally with any part of your body. So, we do have a one-sided. Most of us are like right or left-handed. So we have a side dominance. And, we may do all the heavy lifting on one side and then the fine motor skills on the other side. We have our habits. Remember, the trauma reflex can show up in the upper aspect of this line, not just the lower. Scoliosis is associated with this line. Those are like lateral curves in the spine. We have 4 sagittal curves in the spine, but when lateral ones show up, this is definitely affected. Well, it depends now. If you were born that way, say, then your lateral lines are going to adjust to that bony formation. You want to mitigate too much deviation if you can with the soft tissues. But if you have a bit of scoliosis because of your movement patterns or held postures or the side you sleep on or something like that, then you have a much better chance of rebalancing that. So because that is more of a functional issue, not a structural issue, if that makes sense. Okay. So again, like we're looking at, some people are super stiff in their trunk, they don't move at all. And then sometimes they move so much through the pelvis that the trunk has to move a lot too. And then, you have the problem of like being too stiff when you walk, or the problem where you're just being all over the place when you walk. So all of those things are show up in this lateral line. And then postural twists, which are often associated with scoliosis too. Sometimes if you have scoliosis, you're going to have a slight twist with that. And that could be your bones, or could just be your soft tissue. The other thing too, I would invite you to notice is like if you work at a desk or stand at a desk, sit at a desk, notice if you keep your pelvis in one plane and then you slightly turn to the side. So I really noticed that when I did more desk work, I really noticed that there was a one direction that I was always turning in. And, I really worked on that in my practice to make sure I wasn't getting like stuck over there. But, we're all trying to get work done. We're reading, we're typing and stuff. And we can, really go into the same twist all the time. So we, just want to make sure we twist in the other direction for balance. So these are very, very common things. So let's just kind of look at walking. Can you see from, this looking down on somebody who's walking, hoping you can see that there's a rotation happening. So when this left foot goes forward, your left hip is slightly going forward and your right shoulder is going forward. So even if you stand on one leg and raise your left leg forward, you'll notice that it's quite natural for your right shoulder to come forward. And then you put that down, and then right leg goes forward, your left shoulder goes forward. And then if you're swinging the arms, you see the arm swing opposite to the legs. So there's a natural rotation that's happening here. There's a little bit of, it kind of looks like this at the pelvis, a little bit of rotation. It's not a lot of sideways movement, but there's a little bit of rotation. The pelvis tips anteriorly and posteriorly, kind of on one side than the other. So if you can see what I'm doing like this, we're not assessing posture. So I just want you to know there has to be some movement. If it's super stiff, then, you're going to have a pretty uncomfortable walking pattern. You probably have to take shorter steps, right? So the pelvis is able to move with this movement to allow those long swinging strides and whatnot. And the arm action is actually quite important too, because the shoulder girdle and the thorax rotating a little bit, not too much, but just enough for a nice easy walk, is dissipating impact forces. So that's actually quite important. It's quite important information and vibration that's coming up through the body during walking, and you want that to happen. You want that information and then the dissipation of those impact forces coming up through the tissues of your body. It's actually very important and beneficial for your body, important for your proprioception and whatnot. So again, this is another good reason for walking with your eyes forward, not down at your feet, because that's going to keep your spine nice and tall, and that facilitates that little bit of rotation we need to allow through the trunk of the body. And we can make sure and keep our rotational movement balanced in yoga. So, I'm sure y'all probably do lots of various twisting poses like I'm showing here. Very simple. Most people can do twisting poses. It's very important that your spine is in good alignment, okay, before you go into a twist. If the posture's kind of slumped forward and then you go into a twist, you're bringing the edges of your vertebra closer towards each other. You want them like lined up so that they have lots of space for the rotation. And rotation is very important for the disc health, right? Because it's really during rotational action and walking, which includes a little bit of impact, that your intervertebral discs are absorbing moisture and nutrition, because they don't have a direct blood supply. They're pulling it in from the interstitial tissue around it. So rotational action is very important. And, there's lots and lots of ways we can practice that. Now, what I would recommend is, because you guys ever heard of slipping rib syndrome? A lot of yogis will get it back here. Not so much the form that's in front, although this can happen. But this one here is a little more common in the upper back, upper mid back. So we can, go into a twist a little too aggressively. So that's why I always recommend you going into it actively. Use your own muscles to take you into the twist. And then just wherever that is, stay there and use your breath, because that's really going to help the imbibition of those intervertebral discs. And of course, it actually helps to expand the breath and everything too, because you're working with the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. So, really important, take yourself actively into twists. Here's another example. So with this arm, I'm helping myself resist the twist. So I get myself over there and then I resist as though I'm coming out of it. Or I push this arm and create some kind of resistance through the thorax, breathe into it. Same over here, and same with standing. This is open chain, but same thing, taking an active twist. Okay, now all these twists we're using the arms, and the arms are not part of the lateral lines, but you definitely feel this in the thorax because it's all connected. So yeah, I just think these are really, really good. A lot of people don't do a lot of rotational action, and in fact, that's where they get injured in real life if they're not doing something like yoga. Somebody who has a kind of a stiff walk, they go to, pick something up where they twist and bend and pick it up. That's, just an injury waiting to happen. So having good rotation, having nice, healthy intervertebral discs is the best way to avoid that kind of situation. All right. So there. We'll just quickly look at the trauma reflex here and different reasons for it. So, you can have an injury, right? If you're on crutches for a while, it's going to not just affect this leg, but it's going to affect the torso of your body and your shoulders, because that is very stressful, and you're going to probably have to compensate, right, with your movement. It's not a natural movement at all. And so, sometimes if you're on crutches for long enough, you develop these compensation patterns of which you're not aware of. And even when, you've healed up and everything, they're still there to some degree. And they could be, definitely one-sided or cause some kind of compensation pattern across the body. So just something to be aware of. And these things can, they can be there for 20 years before anybody notices that there's that is causing a problem. Somebody's got their mic on, I think. Somebody have a question?
I muted her, but
Oh,
I'll see.
okay. If anybody has a question, just wave at Mark and get his attention there. Yeah, so remember, way back in Module 1, we were talking about how quickly movement patterns become habits, right? So if you're, using some kind of aid to walking, you're going to develop a new habit, and, you reinforce that every time you walk with that. And then, even when you're able to put weight on your foot and whatnot, again, you could still have, some it's not that the tissue's short and tight, but what it is it's like it's been held in that position for a long time and it doesn't know how to let go. So you need to like unwind from that and create balance on both sides. And the best way to do that is through movement, through breath, and paying attention, so that you notice when you're tightening up, and just, try to go back to a more balanced pattern. Again, we're really all about patterns. Our patterns they kind of run in the show in lots of directions. So we kind of want to choose those patterns and practice good patterns. Okay. Yeah. And so, you can have these imbalances. You can see on him already, like if you have an injury on your right side, it's very natural for the body to lift that shoulder, even if you're not in a sling, because probably the weight of gravity dragging down on it's uncomfortable. It feels vulnerable. And so we often will lift that shoulder up. And then when you're not wearing the sling anymore, that shoulder is still going to, have a habit of doing that because the muscles have been trained to lift the shoulder, So let's look at a couple other things. So that had to do with injury, but we have a lot of one-sided habits, right? And if you think about just things like driving a car, right? You're generally, maybe some of you live in places where you would drive on the right-hand side. But if you drive on the left-hand side of the car, it's your right foot that's on the gas and the brake or what have you. Or if you're, using a clutch or something, then you might have a bit more back and forth. But, your right foot. And, I know over here in Canada, we have a lot of people have issues with their right hip. And, that's kind of where it shows up because the hip is slightly forward all the time, pulled out of its socket ever so slightly. And if you're somebody who drives for a living, then your hip might be in that compromised position a lot. So, that is a case of, your right side doing a totally different job than your left side. The other thing too is, if you have a baby, right, you might have, maybe you're right-handed, so you put the baby on the left hip, so you have, your smart hand or whatever is more available to do stuff. So that can, cause some compensation. But even carrying a purse, like if you carry a purse or a heavy bag or something, that shoulder's going to lift. So that, that can cause compensation too. So you probably have, some grumpy muscles here that are, kind of getting short. They're not changing their length, but they're contracted and lifted for long periods of time. So that can cause some changes. Again, the things we do habitually over a long period of time are what change the body. So here's just a few examples of different forms of scoliosis. And just know that most of us have a little bit of scoliosis, whether that is a bony thing or if it's a result of habits, anything like that. And you may not, and it may never bother you. I know sometimes people go and see a therapist and, they're just getting an assessment and they're told that they've got a little bit of scoliosis and they're just shocked. And now they think they have to fix it somehow. And maybe it'll be fixed with, a balanced practice, but maybe it won't. And maybe it's going to be fine. It doesn't interfere with your life or your movements or your comfort level or anything like that. Most people have a little bit of that. And some people have much more extreme. And, that can be usually a bony thing, right? Something they're born with. And, we can't really change bones, but we can make our tissue feel more comfortable. We can deal with the soft tissue aspect of it, and just, again, practice good, efficient joint patterns and movement patterns. And that's the best we can do. Again, you'd be surprised. You'd be very surprised. Like there are elite athletes with all kinds of bony anomalies and they just work around it, like they just, do the work. And, so anything is possible. I would really avoid, getting things named sometimes because it get really attached to the name. And it's worrisome. It's, scary names and stuff. Feel your body, feel good in your body, work with your body, know your body. And I guarantee you there's most things you can work around. You can work around or you can heal altogether. So or at least to the point where it's not a problem at all. Okay, so that's what I would say about that. But again, if you think about balancing your lateral lines, using your lateral lines in activity, tensioning the fascial lines to create stability and balance and coordinated movement, there is a lot you can do. Because remember, we were looking last time at postures where the energy was going downward. And we saw that if you organize and activated, you're already sending the energy upward. And this is a profound change in the movement of energy in your body. Even your electrical field, your mechanotransduction, piezoelectricity, all of that is affected by how you're moving the energy in your body. So if you choose, to make your body taller, to organize and activate, you can. Sometimes it's just the smallest, tiniest little change, and the experience is totally different. You're not in pain anymore. It feels like you've got control. You've got more freedom of movement. It's amazing. But, it does take practice, and it takes time. As we know, we know the timeline of adaptation. So, again, I would focus toward better habits every time rather than getting really focused on where a problem is. That's what I recommend. Focus on how can I build a better habit. Okay.
Maybe just let them know that it's it's 1:44, so if they have to go.
Yeah. So it's 1:44. I believe this is my last slide. So if you have to go, it's okay. You can slip out. No worries. Otherwise, I'm almost done. Okay. All right. So the lateral lines are our friends in yoga practice. There's so many ways to explore the lateral lines in yoga, aside from just our basic organization and activation, which we're going to do all the time. So here's a few, suggestions. In side bending, I actually really love exploring in this pose. So I've got my toes lifted here, which is a real no-no. So they snapped the picture at the wrong time. But a lot of times people want to bend right over in this pose, right? But I enjoy the exploration of making it a really slow global bend. It's a very slow global curve, and you can really go into your lateral lines here. So the lateral line, right, is coming from basically behind my ear, trunk of the body, hip, and down. So, you can really focus on one side at a time, make your body nice and long. Do a slight twist in this pose where you drop your shoulder back and then look upward. There's just lots of things. You could even step one foot across in front of the other, or stand on the same foot as the side you're bending to and lift the other foot. So just so many things. And I feel like these lateral postures that we do are so important for people to explore, because most of what we do is on the sagittal plane. So giving people some of those lateral frontal plane experiences, I think, are really interesting. It's very good for the brain. Okay, and then something like side plank, you're really using, anyone who does side plank kind of realizes that, it's like this underside is doing all the work, but how can we tap into, the other side, the other line as well? So, if you can kind of focus on that, you have to just know how to work with your lines really well. But you could lift this leg and press that out, and that would definitely give you lots of activation on the outer lateral line. But of course, if you're pushing down into this foot and you're lifting away from the floor like that, you're definitely going to be working your lateral line. And I wouldn't worry about, am I going to make that line short? You're not. And this is not going to make that line longer either. Remember how much collagen is in these tissues that we're talking about here. A ton of collagen, and their role is stability. So, you're not going to change them unless you go in with a surgical blade. So, or again, like you have some kind of major issue where fibers are broken, or you stop having nerve transmission to the muscles that, would tension those lines, or something like that. Is possible, but drastic, not stuff that goes on in yoga. Okay, so yoga is not going to shorten or lengthen those lines. So here's another really great pose that you'd be surprised at where you get stability in a pose like this, because pressing this leg up against something Like if you as a teacher could come along and put a hand here and let your student press into your hand, that would really stabilize this posture for them, because they really be using the lateral line at that point. So, again, press that leg up, press the shoulder back, and that's giving you lots of access to the lateral line, which is, very helpful stabilizer in a pose like this. And this one is really interesting too. I know I've included it in numerous practices as well, but this Garudasana pose, whether or not the foot wraps or not, when you cross the legs over each other like this, you want to activate them. It's like you're trying to push them together, but you're really pulling the legs apart. And that is really activating your lateral lines. And it helps you get the pelvis balanced in this pose. And it is a very, very steady pose if you are pulling the legs apart. Yeah, it's amazing. So some people say squeeze the legs together. And again, I would say that that's not wrong, but that's more using your deep front line. If you it's basically you're pulling it apart from below the knee. Okay, so that's how you have to think about it. Below the knee, you're pulling the legs apart. It turns all of these lateral hip rotator muscles on, and it creates a lot of stability. So I think that's a fun thing to experiment with. A lot of people really struggle with Garudasana, and I find that when I teach it this way, they just feel so successful and happy. So there you go. Okay, and I think that's it, except I want you to remember to look at the experiential exercises, because, that's where I've kind of tried to pick out good experiences so you can actually feel those lines, and the 30 days to activate your asana, right? There's, certain days where I'm really focusing on the lateral lines. I'm kind of going through each line and spending about 3 days on it, and then towards the end of the 30 days we're kind of a little bit all over the place, but that is really, really, those are the experiences you need to have so that you can really land this in your own body, and then you can convey it to your students. And I really do think it's worth doing, obviously. So that's my slides for you today, and if you have any questions, you can ask them now or you can send them along later. Thanks so much for showing up, you guys. I really appreciate it. Hey, Lee, you're the safety one. Okay. Okay, great. Thanks so much. Nice to see you, Lorraine, Nadine, Poonam, Carmen, Nicoletta, Lee, Sandy. Okay. Well, great to see you guys. Good to see your comments in the course, and we'll see you next time. We'll look at the spiral line, very exciting line. Okay, have a wonderful day. Bye.
Bye.